The calibration rod was already stuck when I noticed the hum. I had driven the spike into the base of the steel, the way I'd driven it into every survey anchor point on Vardith Ridge. Without thinking about it, 3 firm taps with the heel of my hand. The motion so practiced it belonged to muscle memory rather than intention. The rod was supposed to seat in the fractured basalt and give me a clean reference line for the morning's grid. Instead, it glanced off something beneath the surface crust, tilted at an angle I hadn't expected, and lodged fast against the base of the pillar. I heard the hum before I registered what had stopped my hand. It was not a loud sound. It was not the resonance of stressed material, not the ping of expanding stone in the pre-dawn cold. It was lower than that, more felt than heard, something that moved through the soles of my boots and settled in the base of my sternum like a tuning fork struck once at the right frequency. I stood still for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when you are alone on a ridge before sunrise, 3 kilometers from the nearest shelter, with every other sound on the plateau running at its normal quiet register. Wind over basalt, the tick of cooling rock, the distant low hiss of the survey station's ventilation stacks. The steel did not hum again. I pulled the rod free, reset it 2 meters north, and went back to work. That should have been the end of it. I have been a survey mapper for 19 years, 11 of them on colonial sites, 7 of those on Vardith Ridge specifically, and I have learned that ruins produce noise, thermal expansion, mineral seep, the slow stress cracking of stone that has been sitting under 6 centuries of colonial foot traffic and 4 decades of survey equipment. You log the anomaly if it repeats. You do not stop working because a pillar made a sound once. But I was back at the steel by mid-morning. I told myself I was cross-referencing the base measurements. I had a full grid section to complete before the weekly authority relay, and the steel sat at the junction of 2 of my reference lines. I had legitimate reason to be there. I set my slab reader against the pillar's south face and waited for the calibration pulse. The surface under my fingertips was warm. Not sun-warm. The ridge had been in shadow until 40 minutes ago, and the stone around the steel was still cold to the touch. I pressed my free hand against the basalt a meter away to be certain. The pillar itself radiated a slow, even warmth, like something held heat from inside. I pressed my palm flat against the carved face. The channel nearest my hand, a shallow groove in the shape of a long, sweeping arc, one of hundreds that covered every face of the pillar in overlapping geometric registers, flushed with a pale blue-white light, dim as phosphorescence. There and then not there, a single breath of luminescence and then nothing. I took my hand away. The warmth remained. I stood at the base of the Vigil Stele for a very long time, looking at a groove of carved stone that showed no trace of light, and I thought about my grandmother. Her name was Petra Solis. She had spent the last 6 years of her life on Vardith Ridge as a settlement liaison, a role the colonial authority created largely to give elderly colonists something useful to do while the real survey work proceeded around them. She had walked this plateau every day for those 6 years. She had stood at this pillar more times than I could count, if the frequency of its appearance in her letters was any measure. She called it the Old Witness, a name that appeared in none of the authorities' cataloging records, and that I had always assumed she had invented herself, with the mild eccentricity of the very old. She told me once, I was 17, sitting in her quarters at the end of a summer I'd spent helping with the settlement's water survey, that the pillar was waiting. I asked her what it was waiting for. She said she didn't know exactly. She said it felt like it was waiting for someone to come home. I was 38 before I took my first posting on Vardith Ridge. My grandmother had been dead for 11 years by then. I told myself the assignment was coincidence. The authority needed a senior mapper who could run a solo grid. I had the qualifications and the availability, and Vardith Ridge was simply the posting that opened. I told myself that for 7 years, with the particular persistence of a person who suspects she is lying to herself and has not yet decided to stop. I had not touched the steel before that morning. Not once. I had mapped around it, under it, referenced its position on 300 survey grids, and never laid a hand on the carved stone. I am not superstitious. I am a mapper. I deal in measurements. I dealt in measurements until the channel lit up beneath my palm. And then I stood on the cold plateau and thought about an old woman who called a ruin by a name no one else used. And I knew, with the particular certainty that has nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the body's slow knowledge, that I was going to go back to the steel. Not yet, not that morning. I had a relay report to file, a grid section to complete, and 11 kilometers of plateau to cover before the light failed. I finished my work. I filed the report. I said nothing about the warmth or the light. But I noted the steel's base coordinates in my personal log, in the margin column where I keep observations that aren't ready to be data yet. I wrote warm first time. The second time happened 3 days later. I was running a soil density scan along the eastern spur, 200 meters from the steel, when my equipment registered a subsurface anomaly, a pressure differential at roughly 4 meters depth, extending in a rough circle of about 30 meters radius. I had run this spur 20 times and never seen the reading before. I flagged it, walked the full circle, and realized at the end of the walk that the steel stood at the center. I sat down on a flat piece of basalt at the edge of the circle and looked at the pillar. The carved channels on its surface were doing something I had not seen before, or perhaps had never looked for before. They were not glowing, but in the early morning light, at a certain angle, they seemed to hold the light differently than the surrounding stone, a faint, ordered shimmer, as if the grooves were traced in a material that had a slightly different refractive index than the basalt. I had noticed it before, logged it as a material variation consistent with differential weathering, and moved on. Looking at it now, with the subsurface anomaly freshly registered on my slab, I saw that the shimmer followed a pattern. The channels lit from the bottom up. Not visibly, there was no glow, no luminescence in daylight, but the differential shimmer was marginally stronger in the lower register of carved arcs and marginally weaker at the crown of the pillar. As if the light within, if there was light within, was pooled lower, concentrated near the base, near where my hand had rested 3 days ago. I stood up, walked to the steel, and put both hands flat on the south face. The warmth was immediate, stronger than before, not hot, but the kind of warmth that tells you a thing is alive and has been patient. And the shimmer moved. I watched it with my own eyes, hands pressed to the stone, as the shimmer in the carved channels shifted, a slow tide of marginal brightening that moved from the registration of my hands upward along the arcs, climbing the lower register, climbing toward the midpoint of the pillar. It traveled perhaps a third of the way up the pillar face before it stopped. I held still. I did not take my hands away. The shimmer remained at its highest point for the full 60 seconds I counted. I counted them carefully, one at a time in the silence. Then it retreated slowly back to the base. When it reached the lowest carved arc, it stopped retreating and sat there, steady, in that faint shimmer pool near the base of the stone. I took my hands away. The shimmer in the lower register remained for another 30 seconds, as if reluctant to release the state it had reached. Then it faded to its resting condition. I filed my soil density scan. I logged the subsurface anomaly as a probable void consistent with previous site surveys. I did not file the shimmer. That night in my quarters, I went through my grandmother's letters for the first time in years. She had written to me once a month, for the 6 years she was on Vardith Ridge. I had read them when they arrived and filed them without much ceremony. I was young and busy, and she was old and slow, and I am not proud of the weight I gave those letters at the time. I read all 71 of them that night. The word tender appeared in the 4th letter. 12 months into her first year on the ridge, she wrote, "There is a word in the old settlers' dialect, tender, that means the keeper of a threshold, not a guard, not a warden, a watcher, someone whose purpose is presence, not protection. I read it in one of the site histories today, and I could not stop thinking about your great-grandmother. She always said the women in our family came back to the same places. I wonder if that is what we are. I read the line 3 times. Then I turned off the light, lay on my bunk in the dark, and listened to the distant tick of cooling stone and the low hiss of the ventilation stacks, and I did not sleep for a very long time. The Colonial Authority examiner arrived 9 days after the subsurface anomaly report. His name was Farron Drost, mid-40s, thorough, the kind of examiner who reads every file in the posted packet before he sets foot on site. He had 3 junior surveyors with him and a xenolinguist named Hesk who specialized in pre-colonial carved inscriptions. He had reviewed my anomaly report on the flight in, and he had questions about the subsurface readings, the soil density variance, and the pillar's material composition. He did not have questions about any light shimmer or warmth, because I had not filed either. I showed him the pillar. He put on his sensor gloves and ran a full material scan of every carved face, every register, every centimeter of the pillar from base to crown. He walked the 30-meter anomaly circle with his own equipment and confirmed the subsurface void, wider than my reading had suggested, possibly 50 meters across at its maximum dimension, at a depth of between 3 and 5 meters. He stood back from the pillar and looked at it with the expression of a man who has found something that doesn't fit neatly into his existing categories and is deciding how to proceed. Under his sensor gloves, against the carved south face, the pillar did nothing. I watched him carefully. He pressed the gloves to the stone for 30 seconds, 40, a full minute, ran the sensor sweep twice. The steel remained exactly what it had been for every examiner, every researcher, every colonial official who had documented it over 4 centuries of settlement history. A carved stone pillar, ancient and inert, the lower register of uncertain antiquity, the subsurface void sealed and silent. It gave him nothing. He and the junior surveyors spent the better part of 2 days running subsurface scans from different angles, building a 3-dimensional model of the void's shape. They were thorough. They were professional. At no point, in 2 full days of close physical contact with the steel's surface as they mounted sensor packages and ran reference cables, did any of them report warmth, shimmer, or response of any kind. Hesk, the xenolinguist, spent those same 2 days pressed against the steel's carved faces with a hand lens and a notation slate, making rubbings and measurements, cataloging the carved registers one by one from base to crown. She was quiet and methodical. On the second afternoon, she came to find me where I was running grid work on the northern spur. She said, "Have you spent much time with the inscriptions?" I said I had mapped the pillar, but wasn't trained in inscription analysis. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, not quite suspicion, not quite excitement, something between the two, a researcher's instinct for a variable that isn't showing up in the data the way it should. She said, "The lower register, the first 40 centimeters above the base, is in a different script than the upper sections. The upper sections are colonial-era settlement markers, standard land claim notation, probably placed 4 to 6 centuries ago. The lower register is something else entirely. The glyphs don't match anything in my reference archive." I said that seemed significant. She said, "It might be. What I can say with confidence is that the lower register is older than the upper settlement markings by a very considerable margin. The weathering differential is pronounced, and the lower register glyphs are not decorative. The repetition patterns are consistent with a functional inscription. Instructions, maybe, or an activation sequence." She paused, then she said, "Or a description of what it's waiting for." She went back to the steel. That evening, Examiner Drost called a site meeting in the survey station's main room. He laid out the preliminary findings. The subsurface void was a constructed space, not a natural cavity. The material composition of its ceiling at the 3-meter depth was consistent with the same compound used in the upper construction of the steel itself, suggesting they were components of the same structure. The void was, in his assessment, a sealed chamber. He said the colonial authority would initiate a full site excavation. He estimated the permit process would take 4 to 6 months. He would recommend the site be placed under a temporary research restriction in the meantime. He asked if any member of the survey team had observed any active behavior from the stele. I said no. Hesk said no. The 3 junior surveyors said no. Drost filed his preliminary report that night. In the morning, he and his team packed their equipment, loaded the shuttle, and left Vardith Ridge. I walked out to the stele after the shuttle's engine note faded from the sky. I put my hands on the south face. The warmth came immediately, stronger than it had been in any previous contact, not hot, but deep, a warmth that seemed to come from a very long way inside the stone, as if something that had been holding itself in careful reserve during the 2 days of authority presence had been waiting for the voices and the equipment and the footsteps to recede. And the shimmer moved faster now, with a readiness that had not been there in the earlier contacts. It climbed past the midpoint, past the 2/3 mark, all the way to the crown of the pillar. The carved channels at the pillar's peak shimmered with a brightness I had to look at sideways, a pale blue-white that was no longer subtle. The entire pillar's surface was running light through every carved arc and angle on every face, all 4 of them, the pillar a column of slow-moving luminescence in the mid-morning sun. I stayed for 20 minutes, my hands pressed to the stone, and felt the warmth hold steady under my palms as though the pillar had waited long enough and was in no particular hurry now that the contact was re-established. When I took my hands away, the light took longer to fade than it had before. It was still faintly present, barely visible, a trace along the lower register, when I reached the edge of the plaza, 40 meters away. I stood at the edge and looked back at it. It looked like something remembering. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that I did not fully understand until much later, looking back. I came to the stele in the mornings. I placed my hands on the south face and held them there for 20 minutes to half hour, and the shimmer climbed and the warmth held, and the light ran through the carved channels with growing ease, the way a path becomes easier to walk each time you walk it. Each morning the resting luminescence of the lower register, visible even when I was not in contact, was a degree brighter than it had been the morning before. I came in the evenings too. I had no formal reason for evening visits. I told myself I was doing ambient temperature studies. The ridge had a marked thermal cycle, significant drop-off after sunset, and I had standing permission to run temperature gradient surveys at any hour. I brought my equipment, and I ran the surveys, and I sat on the flat piece of basalt at the edge of the anomaly circle, and I looked at the pillar and I talked to it. I am aware of how that sounds. I did not talk to it the way someone talks to a pet or a plant. I talked to it the way my grandmother must have talked to it, slowly, practically, at low volume, the way you talk to something when you are not entirely sure it hears you but you have arrived at a point of conviction that it might. I told it about the grid work, about the relay reports, about the season changing on the ridge, the way the wind shifted in the 4th week after solstice, the particular quality of the light on the basalt in late afternoon. I told it about my grandmother, about Petra Solis, her 6 years on the ridge, her letters, the words she had read in a settler history and turned over in her mind until she decided it described something true about the women in our family. I told it about the quality of her handwriting, small and precise, the handwriting of a woman who had spent decades producing official documents and had never lost the habit of exactness. I told it about the summer I spent helping with the water survey. 17 years old, sitting in her quarters in the evenings while she made tea and talked to me about the plateau. I told it her name. The night I told it Petra's name, the lower register channels lit up the way a circuit closes. Not slowly, not with the gradual shimmertide I had grown used to, but all at once, the full lower register glowing with a clear, clean blue-white that threw shadows on the basalt and was visible. I was certain, from the survey station 3 kilometers away. The light held for several seconds, long enough for me to count my own heartbeats, which I did, because I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't reaching for the stone, and then eased back to its resting shimmer with what I can only describe as deliberateness, the way a held breath is released with care. I sat very still on my flat piece of basalt and looked at the pattern of shadows the light had thrown. I said quietly, "Did you know her?" The lower register shimmered once, a single pulse, and went quiet. I sat there until the cold drove me in. Hess came back 6 weeks after the examiner's team had left. She came alone, on her own research authorization, with a leave of absence from her university post and a personal equipment kit that she carried herself off the shuttle. She said she had been unable to stop thinking about the lower register inscription. She had found one partial analog in an archive database, not a match, but a family resemblance, a set of glyph shapes that shared structural features with pre-settlement script systems from 3 other colonial sites in the same sector of the outer marches. She wanted to do a full photographic survey and run a comparative analysis. I said she was welcome to set up in the station. I said I'd show her back out to the Stele in the morning. She looked at me for a moment, the same look she had given me at the northern spur, that researcher's instinct for an undocumented variable. Then she said, "It did something when you were near it, didn't it?" I said, "What makes you say that?" She said, "Because it did nothing when I was near it, and I have been doing this for 22 years, and ruins do not ignore people in exactly the way that Pillar ignored us. There was a quality to its inactivity that felt specific, deliberate, like it had assessed what it was dealing with and made a decision." I thought about that for a moment, then I said yes. I told her about the warmth, the shimmer, the channel that lit when I first pressed my palm to the south face. I told her about the subsurface response as the light climbed higher on successive visits, about the way it had gone still and patient during Drost's 2 days on site, and then opened fully the moment the shuttle cleared the ridge. I did not tell her about the evening conversations or about my grandmother's name and the pulse of light that followed it. Some things are not ready to be data. Hesk listened without expression. When I finished, she said, "How long have you been coming out here?" 7 years. Before the anomaly report. I mapped the pillar regularly. I hadn't touched it. Why not? I thought about the honest answer for a moment. Then I said, "I wasn't ready." She looked at me steadily. Then she said, "Will you take me out tomorrow?" We went at dawn. The ridge was cold and still, the sky that particular pale gray that precedes the sun on a cloudless morning. I put my hands on the south face. The warmth came as it always came, immediately, without delay. The circuit completing the instant contact was made, and the shimmer climbed all the way to the crown again, all 4 faces running with light, the pillar in full activation in the pre-dawn gray. Hesk stood 2 meters back and watched with her notation slate ready, making no sound. After a minute, she stepped forward and placed her own hand on the east face, away from my contact point. The shimmer on the east face did not change. The light continued, uninterrupted, but it ran where it ran, along the register nearest to my hands on the south face, traveling the carved channels that connected south to internal structure to north to west and back. The east face carried ambient light through its own carved arcs, reflecting what the active state produced, but it did not respond to Hesk's hand. No warmth under her palm, if her expression was anything to judge by, and she was a careful woman, and she would have shown it if she had felt anything. She removed her hand after 30 seconds. She wrote something on her slate. We walked back to the station for breakfast, and she spent the rest of the day at the base of the Stele with her photographic equipment, working quietly and thoroughly around the full perimeter. I did my grid work on the western spur and came back to the station at dusk to find her at the kitchen table with a spread of photographs and notes across every available surface. She told me what she had found. She said, The lower register is not an inscription in the sense I usually work with. It is not language. It is closer to a mechanism description, the kind of glyph notation you see on pre-colonial devices that were designed to be operated. Operating instructions, essentially, encoded for a specific input. I said, "What input?" She said, "A person, a specific kind of person. The inscription describes a biological key. Not in those words, the script predates that vocabulary, but the structural meaning is consistent. Someone whose presence, whose living contact, completes a circuit the pillar has been holding open since it was built." I said, "How long has it been built?" She said, "The lower register weathering and the material composition of the subsurface void structure are consistent with a construction date of approximately 12 to 14,000 years before the first colonial-era settlement markers. This site predates the settlement of this world by a very considerable margin. Whatever built the Vigil Stele was not human and did not build it recently." We sat with that for a while. The ventilation stacks hissed outside. The ridge ticked in the cold. I refilled her cup. Then she said, "The inscription also describes what happens when the right person completes the circuit. There is a threshold below us. The void is a doorway and the stele is the lock, and the person who can open it is described in terms that carry a specific role. The analog I found in the pre-settlement archive uses the same structural glyph for a custodial title, not a ruler, not a warrior, not a conqueror." She paused. "The closest word in the colonial lingua is tender." I put my cup down. She looked at me and said, "You've heard that word before." I said, "My grandmother used it. In a letter. She read it in a settler history and wrote to me that it described something true about our family." Hesk was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother was here on this ridge for 6 years. Did she ever touch the stele?" I did not know. There was no record. There was only the word in a letter and the feeling she had described, that the pillar was waiting for someone to come home, and the fact that she had walked this plateau every day for 6 years and called the pillar the old witness, and believed, in whatever way the very old believe things without formal evidence, that it mattered. "I don't know," I said. Hesk nodded slowly. Then she said, "Whatever the threshold opens onto, the inscription says it is meant to be witnessed. The tender's role is not to enter, it is to open and to watch. The title in the glyph structure carries the meaning of a person who holds a window, who keeps it clear, who maintains the frame so that the view does not close, not an owner, not a commander, a holder." I sat at the kitchen table and let the word settle into the same place it had settled when I first read it in Petra's letter, in the margin of a document I had filed without sufficient care, and only retrieved 19 years later because a stone pillar hummed beneath my hand. I said, "I want to go tonight." Hesk said she would come with me. I said I wanted to go alone. She looked at me carefully. She thought it through with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Then she said, "Take a full sensor kit and a medical monitor." I took the sensor kit. I left the medical monitor on my bunk. The ridge at night was cold and very clear. The colonial world's 2 small moons were both up, and they gave enough light to walk by without a hand lamp, which I preferred. I had walked this route in darkness before. The survey work occasionally required it, and the ground was familiar enough underfoot that I moved at a reasonable pace across the basalt field, my boots finding the worn path between the survey markers without conscious direction. The stele was visible from 100 meters. I stopped when I saw it and stood for a moment looking. It was glowing. Not the faint resting shimmer I had grown used to over the weeks of contact. Not the full climb shimmer I saw when I pressed my hands against it in the mornings. The pillar was radiating light in the cold dark of the plateau, a blue-white luminescence, steady and even, running every carved channel on every face from base to crown, the light bright enough to cast my shadow on the basalt when I stood within 20 meters of it. It looked like something that had been asleep for a very long time and had been slowly waking up, degree by degree, through 6 weeks of morning contact and evening conversation, and had tonight arrived at full wakefulness. It was, I realized, waiting for me. It had known I was coming. I stood at the edge of the plaza, the ring of flat basalt that surrounded the stele on all sides, 30 meters across, and I looked at it for a while. Then I walked in. The warmth was noticeable from 10 meters out. Not body warmth, something older, something that felt less like heat from a living thing and more like the warmth of a room that has been carefully maintained at the same temperature for a very, very long time. A tended warmth. Warmth that was itself an act of custodianship, something held in readiness for a specific arrival. I walked through it toward the south face. I stopped 1 meter from the carved stone. Up close, in the full glow of the pillar's active state, I could see details in the lower register carving that I had not been able to see in daylight, or had not been in a state to see. The glyph shapes Hesk had spent weeks photographing. The structural forms she had matched to pre-settlement analogs were interconnected in a way that was only fully apparent when the channels were lit at full brightness. The carved arcs linked from glyph to glyph across the register, forming a continuous path that ran around all 4 faces of the pillar's base, returning to its starting point, a closed loop of meaning at the foundation of the stone. At the center of the south face, at the precise midpoint of the lower register, there was a section I had not noticed before. I had been in contact with the south face a dozen times, and I had not noticed it, which told me the stele had been showing me only what I was ready to see. A carved panel, roughly hand-sized, filled with a glyph cluster that was denser than the surrounding inscription, more complex, more layered, the strokes crossing and recrossing each other in a pattern that my untrained eye could not read but that looked, in the fully lit state, less like an inscription and more like an impression, a shape waiting to be matched. I raised my right hand. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about her 6 years walking this plateau, calling this pillar the old witness, carrying a word she had found in a settler history, and turning it over in her mind like a coin from a place she had never been but somehow recognized. I thought about every woman in our family who had been drawn back to the same places, again and again, without knowing why. Cycles of return. Generations of threshold keeping without a threshold to name. I placed my hand flat against the panel. The warmth under my palm was immediate and different from every previous contact. Not gradual, it was there in full force the instant my hand touched the stone, a living warmth that matched my body temperature exactly and then exceeded it by 1 careful degree, the way a hand clasping yours matches and then slightly exceeds the pressure you offer. It was the warmth of recognition, I thought. Something that had been waiting for this exact contact point, this exact person, and was now simply confirming what it had known was coming. The carved channels under my palm lit up in sequence glyph by glyph, following the closed loop of the lower register, traveling from beneath my hand around the east face, across the north, across the west, and back to the south. A full circuit completed at the base of the pillar, a ring of clear blue-white light running the entire foundation of the stone. The ground moved. Not violently, not a tremor, nothing like a tremor. The basalt of the plaza shifted precisely, with the deliberate precision of a mechanism operating exactly as designed after a very long period of readiness. A circular section of basalt, 30 meters across the full width of the plaza floor, the exact footprint of the subsurface anomaly I had mapped 6 weeks ago, descended 1 centimeter, settled, and then, with a sound like the slowest exhale I have ever heard, began to open. The circular section split along radial lines I had never seen in the basalt surface, because they had been sealed since long before my first survey walk on this ridge, sealed so completely that my equipment had read the plaza floor as a continuous undivided plane. 8 sections, like the petals of something enormous, folding down and aside on mechanisms hidden below the surface, opening the floor of the plaza to the chamber beneath. I kept my hand on the panel. I looked down. The chamber below was lit. Not by anything I had placed there, lit by its own architecture, by a soft, sourceless illumination built into the walls and ceiling of the space. The same cool blue-white as the steel's glow, even and steady, with no flicker. The chamber was circular, perhaps 15 meters across, and its walls were covered every centimeter, floor to ceiling, in the same carved channel inscription that covered the steel's lower register, but at a density and complexity far beyond anything on the pillar above. Hesk was going to stand in that room and weep, I thought, not from sadness, from the sheer scale of it. At the center of the chamber floor stood a second structure, not a pillar but a horizontal slab chest height, carved on its upper surface with a single large glyph that I recognized from the panel beneath my hand. The same dense, layered shape. Larger here, a full-sized rendering, perhaps a meter across, the master inscription from which the panel above had been derived. And arranged around the walls of the chamber, in 24 alcoves cut into the inscribed stone, were 24 sealed objects, each roughly the size of a large storage container, each sealed with a door of the same compound as the steel and the chamber ceiling, each marked above the door with a glyph that shone in a shade that leaned toward warm amber rather than the cooler blue-white of the primary system. 24 things that had been placed here, sealed here, preserved in whatever conditions this chamber maintained, and left for a specific person to find at a specific moment. Left for the tender. I did not know what any of it meant in its details. I knew only that it was intact, undamaged, sealed and preserved in a state of perfect readiness, and that it had been waiting, not with the passive inertness of an abandoned thing, but with the active, maintained patience of something that had been held in readiness, for someone to open the floor and look down. My hand was still on the panel. The steel spoke. It was not a sound that came from outside the pillar, not a voice box, not a speaker, not a mechanical approximation of speech. It came from the stone itself, from the warmth that had been reading me for 6 weeks, transmitted through the carved panel into my palm and up my arm and into my chest, arriving not quite as heard sound, and not quite as felt vibration, but as something between the two, a resonance that carried meaning the way deep music carries feeling, below and before the intellect, in the part of the body that understands things before the mind has words for them. It said, "You held the window tender." 5 words, quiet, measured, with a weight that had nothing to do with volume, the weight of a statement that had been true for a very long time and was simply being confirmed now, the way a surveyor confirms a measurement she already knows is correct, not a revelation delivered to a stranger, a recognition offered to someone who had been expected. I did not move for a long time. The chamber below me continued to glow. The 24 sealed alcoves continued to shine in their warm amber. The basalt sections that had folded aside remained open, patient, the threshold clear and the mechanism satisfied. The warmth under my palm was still matching my body temperature, still exceeding it by 1 careful degree, still holding contact with a steadiness that had outlasted 12,000 years. I thought about my grandmother walking this plateau for 6 years. I thought about the letter and the word, and the question shaped like a hand extended towards something in the dark. I thought about the way she phrased it, not a declaration, a wondering, and I thought about whether she had known or only suspected, or only carried something forward by instinct that she lacked the context to name. She had not had the years I had had. She had not had 7 years of solo work, of solitary mornings on the ridge, of the gradual accumulation of evidence that something was reading her and finding her close but not quite right, the echo of the right blood, not the exact key. Or perhaps she had been exactly right, and the timing had not been. Perhaps the steel had been waiting for the generation after her. Perhaps these things are calibrated over spans that make individual lifetimes look like single survey days. I held the window, the steel had said, but Petra had held it before me, and whoever came before her. The Solis women, coming back to the same places, keeping vigil they did not know they were keeping, maintaining the frame through presence and return, and the patient conviction that some things deserve attention even when they give you nothing back. I said quietly to the stone and to the open threshold and to no one living, she would have liked to see this. The lower register shimmered once, a full pulse, bright and deliberate, then settled. I took out my recording equipment carefully with my free hand, and I turned it on. I did not take my hand from the panel. I began to document. Hesk was awake when I returned to the station. She was sitting in the kitchen with tea and her notation slate, and when I came through the door she looked at my face and did not ask how it had gone. She asked, "Is the chamber intact?" I said completely. 24 sealed alcoves, inscribed walls from floor to ceiling, a central slab with the primary glyph. I have 4 hours of recording. She said, "Did it speak?" I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What did it say?" I told her. She wrote it on her slate in the colonial lingua, and then transliterated the phonetic form, and then sat looking at both renderings for a while. The way she looked at inscription analogs, methodically, from multiple angles, as though meaning might be distributed across the forms rather than contained in any one of them. She said, "Tender," the custodial title, as I read the lower register inscription. I said, "Yes." She said, "You held the window, the threshold keeper's primary function, maintaining the frame." I said, "Yes." She looked up from her slate. She said, "Your grandmother suspected something like this." I said, "I think she carried the knowledge without the context to finish it. Like a word in another language you know the sound of but not the meaning, until the day you hear it used correctly." Hesk thought about that for a long moment. Then she said, "The chamber has been sealed for 12 to 14,000 years. The 24 alcoves, whatever they contain, has been in there for at least that long, preserved, waiting to be witnessed by the right person." She paused. "By the tender." I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you think is in them?" I said, "I don't know yet." I said it the way I say it when I mean, "I will find out." The way a mapper says it about a ridge that hasn't been fully surveyed, not from uncertainty about whether the answers exist, but from the understanding that knowing comes from work, careful and unhurried and done in the right order. I poured myself tea and sat at the table across from her, and we sat together in the early hours of the morning, with the ventilation stacks hissing outside and the cold ridge settling around the station. And I thought about the chamber below the plaza and the 24 things waiting in their amber-lit alcoves and the steel standing above it all in its full luminescence, the window held open at last. I thought about what it means to be the person a very old thing was built to wait for. Not the hero of a story about battle or crisis or enemy turned. Just a woman who mapped a ridge for 7 years and put her hand on a stone and held still long enough for something ancient to confirm what it already knew about her bloodline. The tender, the one who keeps the window clear so that whatever is meant to be seen can be seen. I thought about my grandmother, who had walked this plateau for 6 years and suspected something and written a letter about a word she found in a settler history. She had held the window before she knew the window existed. She had held it by coming back, by staying, by calling the pillar a name that was almost right, by passing forward to me, in 71 letters I had not read carefully enough, everything she knew without knowing she knew it. She had held it for me, in the way that parents and grandparents hold things for people who are not yet ready to hold them themselves. I thought, "Petra, I think you always knew." The Colonial Authority excavation permit came through 5 months later. Examiner Drost returned with a full team, 16 people, proper excavation equipment, a xenolinguistics consortium, a materials preservation unit, and 2 members of the Pre-Settlement Artifacts Committee who had flown in from the core worlds after reading Hesk's preliminary analysis with the kind of attention that indicated they had read it more than once. They arrived to find the plaza floor open, the chamber below fully illuminated, the Vigil Stele in active state, its light running full on every face in the cold plateau morning. Drost stood at the edge of the open plaza for a long time, looking down into the light of the chamber. His team moved around him, unpacking, setting up, beginning the documentation process that would consume the next several months and eventually the better part of several careers. He stood still and looked. Then he turned to me and said, "How long has it been open?" I said, 5 months. He said, "You opened it." I said, "Yes." He looked at me with the expression of a man recalibrating a set of assumptions he had built over a long career, not angrily, not defensively, but carefully, the way a thorough man recalibrates. He said, "The preliminary report said the pillar was inert." I said it was for everyone else. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the steel, at its active state, at the light running through channels he had pressed sensor gloves against for 40 minutes without result. Then he said, "The authority will need a full account." I said, "I have recordings." He nodded. He looked back at the chamber, at the 24 alcoves with their amber-bright glyphs, at the central slab with its primary inscription, at the carved walls running their full illumination from floor to ceiling in a density that had made Hesk stand at the base of the descent for 3 full minutes before she could speak. He said quietly, "What is it?" I said, "A threshold. The steel is the lock. The chamber is the viewing room, and the 24 alcoves are what it was built to hold." I paused. "Whatever is in the alcoves has been sealed here since before the settlement of this world. We haven't opened any of the doors. We've been documenting the inscription, studying the preservation conditions, building a proper record. The alcoves are intact." He said, "Who gave the authorization to wait on the alcove doors?" I said, "I did." He looked at me. I said, "I am the tender. The inscription is explicit about the protocol. Hesk's analysis is in the research packet you were sent, along with my recordings and her comparative archive work. The alcoves open when I choose to open them, in the order I choose, when the documentation is sufficient. The threshold doesn't respond to the authority's permit schedule. It responds to me." Another long look. He was not a stupid man. He had read Hesk's analysis. He could see the steel's active state. He understood in the way a thorough professional eventually understands when evidence is unambiguous that something had happened here that his initial assessment had not captured. He was working through whether there was a procedural argument to be made, and arriving at the conclusion that there was not one that would hold. He said, "All right." He turned back to his team and began directing the setup of the excavation perimeter, and I walked back to the south face of the steel and stood near it, not touching, just near, while the authority team moved their equipment into position around me, setting up their sensor arrays and their documentation stations and their preservation scaffolding. And the steel held its light steady, and even in the plateau morning, and the 24 alcoves waited in their warm amber glow in the chamber below. Hesk came to stand beside me. She had the expression she had worn in Drost's first briefing, the look for an undocumented variable, except now the variable was documented, and the expression had shifted into something quieter and more permanent, something that would probably stay in her face for the rest of her career. She said, "Ready." I thought about my grandmother's letters. I thought about the warmth under my palm and the voice from the stone, and the 5 words that had moved through me like deep music in the cold dark of the plateau. I thought about 12,000 years of patience, of a threshold held in readiness by something that understood time the way stone understands time, not as urgency, not as the grinding expenditure of a resource, but simply as the medium in which things wait for their proper moment. The proper moment was here. I was the proper moment. I said yes. I stepped to the panel on the south face. I placed my hand against the carved stone. The warmth came immediately, full and even, the familiar degree of temperature above my own. The circuit completed the instant contact was made. The window open as it had been open every morning for 5 months, and as it would remain open for as long as I was standing. I said at normal volume, to no one in particular and to everyone present, "Let's see what they left us." I walked down into the chamber. I walked to the first alcove. I placed my hand on the sealed door and felt the amber glyph above it brighten at my touch. The same response as the panel above, the same recognition, the same circuit completing. The door opened. That is what a tender does. The first door held a record. Not a text, not a carved inscription. A record in the sense of a preserved state, a sealed environment maintained at perfect conditions for a duration I could not yet calculate. Inside the alcove, held in a suspension field that deactivated when the door opened, was a collection of objects arranged on a low shelf of the same carved compound as the chamber walls. 17 objects, each catalogued in some internal registry I did not have access to yet, each held in the amber-lit readiness of something that expected to be retrieved. I did not touch them. I documented them, photograph by photograph, dimensions, surface material, condition, position on the shelf. I worked through the first alcove for 2.5 hours, while Drost's team worked their own documentation above, and Hesk stood at the base of the descent with her notation slate, watching me with the patience of someone who understood that this was not a moment to rush. When I came back up, I sat on the edge of the open threshold with my feet dangling over the chamber and my recording equipment open on my lap, and I looked at what I had documented. 17 objects, intact, 12,000 years old at minimum, and the inscription above the alcove door, the dense amber glyph, was, according to Hesk's analysis, a designation, a category marker. It meant, in the structural vocabulary of the lower register, things made by hand on this world before the silence. Before the silence. I looked at the steel. The steel shimmered steadily in the plateau morning, running its full illumination through every carved channel, holding the window open. Holding it for me, the way it had been holding it for 12,000 years, not with urgency, not with distress at the length of the wait, but with the calm steadiness of something that was designed for exactly this duration, and was now in its proper operational state. I said quietly, "How many worlds?" The lower register pulsed once, a slow wave of increased brightness that traveled up the pillar and back down, the way a wave moves through deep water, not fast, not dramatic, but carrying all the weight of the depth it came from. I did not know the answer, but I knew the shape of it. 24 alcoves, 24 category markers, 24 collections of things made and preserved and sealed, waiting for the person who held the window to open the doors and look. A record of what had been here, what had been made here, what had been lived here on this world before whatever silence had followed. The tender's purpose was not to guard it and not to own it. It was to witness it, to hold the window clear and let the light through, so that what was preserved here could be seen by the people who came after, the settlement people, the colonial authority people, the xenolinguists and the historians and whoever came after them. The steel had not been waiting for a hero. It had been waiting for a reliable witness. I thought about that for a long time, sitting on the edge of the open threshold with the cold plateau wind moving across the basalt and the chamber glowing steady below me. A reliable witness, someone whose bloodline had been seeded or selected or drawn or shaped over generations. I did not fully understand the mechanism to come back, to keep coming back, to maintain the connection, however unconscious, however uncomprehending, until the moment arrived when comprehension was possible and the threshold could open. My grandmother had walked this plateau for 6 years and called a pillar the old witness. She had named, without knowing it, what she was. What we were. I closed my recording equipment. I stood up. I brushed the basalt dust from my field jacket. Drost was standing nearby, watching me with the careful attention he gave to everything that did not fit his preliminary report. He said nothing. He had learned, in the 5 hours since his shuttle landed, that this situation rewarded patience. I said, we'll open one alcove per week. I'll lead the documentation in the chamber. Hesk will lead the inscription analysis above. Your team handles the surface survey and the preservation scaffolding. I paused. This is going to take years. He said, the authority will assign a permanent research station. I said, good, the ridge needs it. I looked at the steel. It shimmered steadily, all four faces running light in the mid-morning sun, the window open and held and clear. I thought, Petra, it took us long enough. I thought we're here now. I walked back to the south face and placed my hand on the panel, and the warmth came as it always came, immediate, even 1 careful degree above my own temperature, and the circuit held, and the threshold stayed open. There was work to do. That is what a tender does. The work, steady and unhurried, in the presence of things that have waited long enough to deserve the time it takes to do it right. I did not stop at the south face that evening. I walked the full perimeter of the steel, all four faces, the full ring of the plaza with my hand trailing along the carved channels, and every face was warm, and every face ran its light under my palm, and the full circuit completed on every pass around the stone. The pillar was fully awake. It had been fully awake for 5 months, and it would remain awake for as long as I maintained contact. And after me, if the pattern held, for whoever came next in the Solis line, whoever the bloodline produced that would feel the pull of this particular ridge and take a posting here and walk past this pillar for years, before finally placing a hand against the south face and holding still long enough to feel what I had felt. The window would not close again. I understood that now. It had been sealed because the tender had been absent for a very long time, not gone, but unready, the bloodline present on the ridge but not yet calibrated, not yet in contact, generations cycling through awareness without the final step. The steel had not been dormant out of failure. It had been dormant out of patience, holding the window at the frame while the key came closer, generation by generation, each one a degree nearer to the contact point, until the morning I drove a calibration rod into the basalt and heard it hum. 12,000 years is a long time to wait. It is not, apparently, longer than necessary.